On the afternoon of the 22nd of July 1812, the country south of Salamanca looked calm from a distance. Low ridges crossed the dry ground. Two steep, flat-topped hills rose above the plain near the village of Arapiles. Wheat fields and patches of woodland broke the view, hiding parts of two armies that had spent days trying to outmaneuver each other. Marshal Auguste Marmont believed the moment had finally turned in his favor. Dust was rising along the road toward Ciudad Rodrigo, the route that led west toward Portugal. He interpreted it as evidence that Wellington had begun to withdraw. French divisions on the left were ordered to move farther west, extend beyond the Allied right, and threaten the road of retreat. The movement appeared sensible. It also created the opening that Wellington had been waiting for. From behind the ridges, most of the Allied army remained concealed. As the French left wing lengthened, the distance between its divisions increased. Troops that were supposed to support one another were moving across broken ground in separate bodies. Their attention was directed toward a retreat that had not yet begun. A famous later account has Wellington turning to the Spanish officer Miguel de Lava and saying, "Marmont is lost." The exact wording cannot be established with complete certainty. The judgment behind it is easier to understand. Marmont had exposed his left wing while assuming that his opponent would continue moving away. Wellington did the opposite. He attacked. The phrase, 40 minutes, is often attached to Salamanca. The whole battle lasted much longer, continuing into the evening. Yet the destruction of the French left developed with remarkable speed. In a short interval, a maneuver intended to trap the Allied army became the cause of a French defeat. To understand how that happened, it is necessary to begin with the campaign that brought both armies to these ridges. By 1812, the war in the Iberian Peninsula had lasted for 4 years. Napoleon had first sent troops through Spain to invade Portugal in 1807. In the following year, he removed the Spanish Bourbon monarchy and placed his brother Joseph on the throne. The decision transformed a limited intervention into a wider occupation. Resistance spread across Spain. While Britain established a durable military base in Portugal, the Allied army was never simply British. Wellington commanded British regiments alongside a large Portuguese contingent, with Spanish forces also present. Their survival depended on Portugal's ports, on British finance, and on supply arrangements that allowed an army to remain in the field without relying entirely on local requisition. French strength in Spain was substantial, but it was divided among several commands. French armies had to guard roads, hold cities, protect communications, and respond to Spanish regular forces and guerrillas. A large total on paper could not always be concentrated at the point where Wellington chose to act. During the first months of 1812, Wellington captured Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz, the two major fortresses controlling the main invasion routes between Portugal and Spain. These operations were costly, but they opened the frontier. In May, troops under Rowland Hill struck the bridge at Almaraz, disrupting the connection between Marmont's army of Portugal and French forces farther south. Napoleon's preparations for the invasion of Russia made reinforcement from France more difficult. Wellington did not suddenly possess overwhelming superiority. He did, however, have a temporary opportunity to fight one French army before the others could combine against him. In June, the Allies advanced toward Salamanca. The city was entered on the 17th of June and its fortified convents surrendered later that month. Marmont then gathered his army and began a campaign of maneuver. He did not want to attack Wellington in a carefully prepared position. Wellington, for his part, did not want to risk the only major British-led army in the Peninsula without a clear advantage. The result was a contest of marching, concealment, and information. Each commander tried to threaten the other's communications, while avoiding a battle on unfavorable terms. For several days in July, the armies moved close to one another. At times, soldiers could see the opposing columns across the landscape. This was not hesitation in the ordinary sense. Both commanders understood that a general battle could decide the campaign. Neither wished to begin it on the enemy's terms. Marmont's plan was based on a sound operational problem. Wellington's army depended on the road west toward Ciudad Rodrigo and Portugal. If the French could move around the Allied right and reach that road first, Wellington might have to retreat northward or accept battle from a compromised position. The French marshal also believed he had learned something important about his opponent. Wellington had often used reverse slopes, placing infantry behind ridgelines where French artillery could not easily see or strike them. He had won major defensive battles at Busaco and Fuentes de Oro. Marmont concluded that Wellington preferred to receive attacks and was reluctant to commit his army in an open offensive. That assessment was incomplete. Wellington was cautious because the strategic consequences of defeat were severe. Caution did not prevent him from attacking when the balance of risk changed. His defensive reputation helped him at Salamanca, because it influenced what Marmont expected him to do. On the morning of the 22nd of July, the two armies were positioned near the Arapiles. The French secured the larger of the two steep hills. The Allies held the smaller height and occupied ground behind a long ridge. The French advantage on the Greater Arapile forced Wellington to adjust his right, and early movements offered him no obvious reason to begin a battle. He was also receiving reports that French reinforcements might soon arrive. In his dispatch after the battle, Wellington wrote that he had decided to retreat towards Ciudad Rodrigo, if no favorable opportunity appeared that day. Baggage and other elements were already moving west. The dust they raised contributed to Marmont's belief that the entire army was leaving. Around 2 in the afternoon, the French intention became clearer. Marmont extended his left under artillery cover. The divisions of Thomirez, Morcune and Brenier moved westward, while other French troops remained closer to the Greater Arapile and the center. This movement did not create a perfectly empty battlefield between each division. Armies rarely formed the neat shapes shown on simplified maps. The danger came from growing separation, disrupted alignment, and the difficulty of changing from a marching movement into a coordinated defensive front. The leading French formations were advancing toward the Allied line of retreat, while their own center was no longer close enough to support them quickly. Terrain made the problem worse. Ridges that limited French observation allowed Wellington to shift troops without revealing the full scale of his response. Marmont could see signs of withdrawal, but he could not see the entire army waiting behind the high ground. This mattered because command in 1812 depended on eyesight, mounted messengers, and the ability of subordinate officers to interpret orders while formations were already moving. A division sent west could not be turned instantly. Its battalions had to halt, change direction, find room to deploy, and recover their alignment. Dust, folds in the ground, and artillery smoke reduced the information available to headquarters. By the time a report reached Marmont, the situation described in it might already have changed. The French extension therefore created more than physical distance. It created delay. The leading divisions could not quickly learn what was happening near the center, while the center could not immediately judge the pressure falling on the left. Wellington's concealed position shortened his own decision cycle. He could observe the French movement from the ridges and send orders to troops already placed within striking distance. Wellington now had a chance to create local superiority. He did not need to defeat every French division at once. He needed to strike the exposed left before the French center could restore the connection. Orders moved rapidly. Edward Pakenham's 3rd Division, together with Benjamin D'Urban's Portuguese cavalry, was directed against the outer end of the French line. James Leith's 5th Division would attack farther east. Heavy cavalry under John Le Marchant stood ready to exploit any break. The 4th Division under Lowry Cole advanced nearer the center, while the 6th Division remained available as a reserve. The design relied on timing. Pakenham's troops had to turn the French flank before Thomirez could establish a secure front. Leith's advance would prevent Morcune from concentrating against Pakenham. Cavalry could then attack infantry already unsettled by fire and movement. This is the central answer to the question raised by Salamanca. Wellington did not win because British infantry possessed some automatic advantage over French infantry. He won the opening phase because the Allied army struck separate French formations in sequence, using concealment to achieve surprise and reserves to keep the attack moving. The usual contrast between French columns and British lines can also be misleading if treated as a complete explanation. French battalions were capable of deploying into line, and British units did not always fight in one formation. At Salamanca, the decisive issue was whether units had enough warning and space to prepare. Tomires's men were caught while the French wing was still carrying out a maneuver. Their problem was not nationality. It was that the battle began in a direction, and at a moment they had not expected. Pakenham's 3rd Division began the decisive action on the Allied right. It approached across ground that had partly screened its movement. Tomires's division was still oriented along the westward march and had limited time to face the new threat. The attack came against the French flank rather than against a settled line. D'Urban's Portuguese cavalry operated alongside the infantry and threatened attempts to reorganize. Tomires was killed during the fighting. His division suffered heavy losses and broke under the pressure. The speed of this collapse mattered beyond the losses themselves. Soldiers from the broken division moved back toward Morcune, carrying confusion into the next French formation. Officers farther east had to decide whether to continue the original maneuver, turn toward Pakenham, or fall back toward the center. Each choice required time, and Wellington's attack was designed to deny them that time. The 5th Division advanced against Morcune. French battalions tried to form a defensive position while facing infantry in front and the possibility of cavalry nearby. Once their order began to weaken, Lamarchan's heavy dragoons charged. Cavalry was most effective against infantry that had lost cohesion or had been forced into hurried formations. It was far less reliable against steady troops prepared in square. At Salamanca, the earlier infantry attack created the conditions that allowed the cavalry to do greater damage. Lamarchan's brigade drove into retreating French units, then continued against formations belonging to Brenier's division. The charge expanded the rupture on the French left and prevented damaged battalions from calmly rebuilding a line. Lamarchant was killed during the action, but the effect of the charge had already become decisive. This was the period remembered in the compressed phrase about 40 minutes. The number should not be treated as a precise stopwatch measurement of the whole battle. It describes the astonishing rapidity with which several French divisions lost their ability to operate as an organized wing. The collapse was severe, but the battle was not finished. The French still held important ground near the Greater Arapile. Their center and right contained experienced troops, and Wellington's own attack had produced exposed flanks. French command was also changing under extreme pressure. Marmont was badly wounded by artillery fire near the beginning of the main action. General Jean-Pierre Franois Bonnet, who assumed command, was wounded as well. Responsibility then passed to General Bertrand Clausel. Clausel did not simply preside over a rout. He recognized that the Allied center had become vulnerable. Pack's Portuguese brigade attacked the Greater Arapile but failed to take it. Cole's 4th Division pushed forward nearby and became exposed when French troops counterattacked. For a time, the French response threatened to reverse part of Wellington's success. The 4th Division was forced back after hard fighting. Cole was wounded. William Beresford helped redirect troops from the 5th Division against the French flank, and was also wounded. This phase is important because it prevents Salamanca from becoming a story in which one observation solved every problem. Wellington's first decision created the opportunity for victory. His use of reserves prevented that victory from being lost during the French counterstroke. He ordered Henry Clinton's 6th Division forward to restore the center. Fresh troops replaced formations that had suffered during the advance. The French attack was checked, while the destruction of their left continued to narrow the options available to Clausel. As evening approached, the remaining French divisions attempted to form a defensive line and cover the retreat toward the River Tormes. Ferry's division made a determined stand, buying time for other units to withdraw. Foy's division also helped protect the army as it moved toward the crossings. The fighting continued until darkness. This alone shows why the battle cannot literally be reduced to 40 minutes. The rapid destruction of the left wing decided the direction of the battle, but several hours of combat were required to complete the victory. Night also limited the Allied pursuit. Wellington expected a Spanish garrison to hold the crossing at Alba de Tormes, but the position had been evacuated without his knowledge. The French therefore escaped by a route that he had believed closed. In a letter written after the battle, Wellington complained that had he known the crossing was open, he might have captured much more of Marmont's army. The figures vary slightly among accounts, but the general scale is clear. Wellington had about 48,000 men, including British, Portuguese, and Spanish troops. Marmont had roughly 50,000. Allied casualties were a little above 5,000. French losses were around 14,000 killed, wounded, or captured, together with guns, standards, and 2 eagles. Those numbers reveal another weakness in the idea that the French were defeated by superior Allied strength. The armies were broadly comparable in size. The decisive imbalance existed only at selected points. Wellington concentrated force against the extended French left while much of Marmont's army was unable to intervene in time. The tactical result opened the road to Madrid. Wellington entered the capital on the 12th of August and Joseph Bonaparte withdrew. French authority in central Spain was badly shaken. The victory also increased pressure on French forces elsewhere in the Peninsula. News of Salamanca also mattered in London. The campaign in Spain required money, shipping, and continued political support. A clear victory helped justify those costs, at a time when Britain's continental strategy had often produced frustration. In Spain, the defeat weakened the claim that Joseph's government could provide stable rule under French protection. It encouraged resistance, though local conditions still varied greatly and French armies remained powerful. The consequences, however, were not a straight march toward final victory. Wellington later failed to take Burgos and withdrew when French armies concentrated against him. Madrid could not yet be held permanently. Salamanca changed the strategic balance, but it did not end the war in 1812. Its deeper importance lay in what it demonstrated about command. Marmont's error was not the simple act of moving left. An attempt to cut Wellington's communications was reasonable. The failure came from making that movement on the basis of incomplete observation, extending beyond reliable mutual support, and assuming that the enemy would behave according to an established reputation. Wellington's success depended on more than noticing a gap. He had already positioned Pakenham where the French flank could be reached. His divisions could move behind ridges that concealed their intentions. He issued a coordinated plan quickly, then retained enough strength to respond when Clausel counterattacked. The Allied army also had the institutional experience required to carry out those orders. British and Portuguese units had campaigned together for years. Staff, work, divisional organization, and disciplined movement allowed a decision made at headquarters to become action across a wide battlefield. The plan still involved uncertainty, but it did not rely on improvisation by one man alone. Salamanca therefore offers a careful answer to its famous title. France was not defeated in Spain within 40 minutes, and Marmont's entire army did not vanish in that time. A major part of his army was placed in an exposed position, then struck before it could recover. Once the left wing collapsed, French command had to fight for survival rather than continue its original plan. The battle continued into darkness. Its decisive logic had been established much earlier. Marmont saw dust and believed he was watching an army retreat. Wellington saw the French line extending and understood that it could no longer support itself. One commander acted on a mistaken picture. The other used the terrain, his reserves, and the readiness of the Allied divisions to turn that mistake into a defeat. That was the achievement of Salamanca. It showed that Wellington's caution was a method of preserving options, not an inability to attack. When the conditions changed on the 22nd of July 1812, he recognized the change before his opponent did. The famous 40 minutes were possible because the preparation had taken years.